morning, good late morning, pre-lunch. My name is Samar Ali, and I'll be chairing panel number 2. I'm a faculty member in Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan here. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Rudolph Ware, known as Butch Ware. Rudolph Ware is a historian of Africa and Islam. He earned his PhD in history in 2004 from the University of Pennsylvania, where he trained in African history, African American history, and Islamic intellectual history. He's currently an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Michigan, and the founder and director of Ikhlas, a research initiative for the study of Islamic knowledge, histories, and languages, arts, and sciences. Ware's research projects have been supported by grants from Fulbright, Ford, Woodrow Wilson, the Mellon Foundation, and has been a residential fellow at the French Institute for the Advanced Study in Marseille, as well as École de Haute Études Ancienne École, my French terrible pronunciation, in Paris. Ware's published articles include chapters in the Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 3 and 4, which detail the rise and fall of institutions in Muslim Africa between the 15th and 20th centuries. He has also published translations in rhymed verse of some of the Arabic poetry of West African scholars, scholar Ahmadou Bamba. His first book, The Walking Quran, explores 1,000 years of history through the lens of the Quran school, the basic institutions of education for millions of boys and girls throughout the region. Please join me in welcoming Butch Ware.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Thank you for everyone for taking time. Thank you especially for those of you who have traveled to be a part of this auspicious initiative. And thank you especially to Juan Cole for birthing this idea and nurturing it and now bringing it into being, into fruition. And we hope that it will grow to be healthy and strong and prosperous. I remember that when this was a conversation that we had over lunch about something like this happening, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction to be here with so many luminaries, people who have written far more and far better than I have. So I'm pleased to be part of this group. I'm also pleased to thank particularly Pauline Jones, who gave us our opening introduction, our host here as the director of the International Institute, and the patron saint not only of the Peace Initiative. I'm going to step away from this because it seems to be giving a little bit of feedback, or is it okay? It's fine. She's also the patron saint, and the International Institute, through that same enterprise fund, has funded Ikhlas, the Islamic Knowledge, Histories, and Languages, Arts, and Science Research Initiative, which is an initiative that brings together classically trained Muslim scholars and university-trained academics in collaborative research on the traditional sciences of Islam, on the ulum ad-din. So Pauline is doing amazing work supporting Islamic studies. And even though Carla's not here, I also wanted to thank her for her support. Okay. So I sent 2 titles for the paper, and there's different ones on different flyers, so I put them both on the screen. Principles of Pacifism, or Principled Pacifism, or alternatively, Traditions of Tolerance in Islamic West Africa. Both titles fit for reasons that'll become clear. Today's talk comes out of basically, it's at the intersection of a couple of different book projects, one that's in the works and one that is already finished. The one that's in the works is a book that's about dreams and visions in Islamic West Africa that I'm about 45,000 words into an 80,000 word manuscript on. And the kind of main vignette that will structure today's talk comes from that book, as do some of the reflections. So if you hear a lot about dreams and waking state visions in my discussion of peace in West Africa, that's why. This is the basic subject of the book. It's about the relationship between the two primary meanings of the word visionary in the English language as they play themselves out in West Africa. So someone who experiences visions of a religious or spiritual kind, and someone who provides imaginative social leadership. The sort of main figure in the story is this man, and he's going to be our narrator for an important part of today's talk. He's a person who's the author of 200 separate works in the Arabic language, some of them collections of as many as 200 poems, some of those poems as many as 5,000 lines. He's also a person who develops a Sufi order, the Muridiyya, that has an absolute and total commitment to nonviolence. And so we're going to look through the window of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba at this question of peace, principled pacifism in Islam. So it draws on that Visionaries book. It also draws on my first book, The Walking Quran, which the argument of which is represented visually here, that the goal of traditional Quran schooling in West Africa is to inscribe the book of God onto the flesh and blood of human beings so that they become, as the Prophet is described in Hadith, Quran walking upon the earth, and to transmit that from one generation to the next. So it's a history of 1,000 years of Quran schooling, and it's particularly about embodiment and the role of embodiment in transmission of Islamic knowledge in West Africa. And I'm shy even to speak about that in the presence of Professor Lamine Saneh, who's quoted liberally in both my doctoral dissertation and in the Walking Quran, and who grew up in the kind of schools that I describe in the Walking Quran. So that's the visual representation of the argument of that book. The book could have just as easily looked like this, because it's an argument, especially in the introduction, about why Islamic study scholars and African study scholars ought to be paying more attention to Africa when they study Islam and not leave it out of the story. 1 in 6 of the world's Muslims lives in sub-Saharan Africa, more than 320 million Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa, more than twice as many south of the Sahara as there are north of the Sahara, more Muslims in Nigeria than there are in Egypt, more Muslims in Ethiopia than there are in Iraq, higher percentage of Muslims in Senegal than in Syria. Africa tends to be systematically ignored when we discuss Islam. Fortunately, we have forward-thinking intellectuals planning this event, so Africa has not been kept out. In fact, Africa figures prominently, and largely because traditions of tolerance and peaceful interpretations of Islam predominate in sub-Saharan Africa. Africa is, by the way, also probably the only continent in the world with a Muslim majority. So the visual argument of the book, and can you just lower press setting number 2, it's the second button. Yeah. Is it easier to see now? Yeah. Okay. The argument of that book could also have been represented this way, with the image of Bilal making the adhan from the top of the Kaaba. I talk about the fact that dark-skinned Muslims were exemplars of knowledge and piety in the early days of Islam. The Prophet, peace be upon him, paid attention to them. We ought to as well. So it was a particularly salutary move to have South African panelists begin, then me, then Lamine Saneh. The book also could have been represented in this way, which is a picture of Ahmadou Bamba, the founder of the Muridiyya, standing across a map of Africa, because many of the arguments in the book are informed by the history and sensibilities of the Muridiyya Sufi order, a Sufi order that claims roughly 5.5 million adherents, most of whom live in Senegal, but many of whom are dispersed in diaspora communities throughout the world. And today's main story, and there's going to be a few stories hidden within the main story, is going to be about him and about his approach to peace. So you'll be introduced today to 5 West African scholars. He's going to be our main overarching scholar and indeed poet, as you'll see in a moment. The second is Sheikh Moussa Kamara, also from Senegal, another scholar who was explicitly pacifistic and nonviolent in his literary scholarship. He's the author of at least 47 distinct works. He was more of a prose writer, whereas Bamba wrote poetry. He was also a historian. Some of Sheikh Moussa Kamara's histories are more than 800 manuscript pages in length, and he wrote 47 books. Cherno Bokar Salif Tal lived in the French Sudan, what's now Mali. He's the descendant of the founder of one of the largest so-called jihad states in 19th century West Africa, El Hajj Umar Tal, who will also figure in this talk, but in a less direct way. Cherno Bokar Salif Tal is someone who also articulates quite clearly and forcefully arguments about tolerance and pacifism. Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, both of these two men, Cherno Bokar Salif Tal and Ibrahim Niass, are from the Tijani Sufi tradition, but from different branches of the same Tijani Sufi tradition. Sheikh Ibrahim Niass's community, the Jamaat al-Faida, probably today claims as many as 70 or 75 million disciples worldwide, most of them in West Africa from Senegal to Sudan, but many here in Detroit, many in Chicago, many in South Africa. I actually was at a Wazifa Dhikr session with the Tijani brothers in Cape Town in my first visit there in 2013. So this community of the flood has poured out all over the world. And it might well be the largest single Sufi movement, if we think of a Sufi movement rather than just a tariqah in today's world. And many of you are probably hearing about it for the first time today, at least the non-specialists in the room. And the last scholar is kind of one of our core collaborators and dear friends in the initiative of Ikhlas. I said Ikhlas brings together classically trained scholars and academics. Imam Fore Drame is from a traditionally trained Jahanke scholar from the Gambia who gave the first keynote for an Ikhlas event in this very room. And it seemed as though half of Detroit showed up that night to fill this room. We were busting out of the doors. He's also a person who makes particular arguments about tolerance and nonviolence. And he is, in a certain sense, I think the most the most intellectually interesting living Jahanke thinker. He's based in Vancouver. Okay, so 5 African scholars, 5 overlapping principles. These principles that we're calling our principles of pacifism or our traditions of tolerance are all shared by the different 5 people that are mentioned here, but I'm going to use each one as an exemplar of a particular value, just so that it sticks in your mind easier, because we're going to cover a lot of ground. As you already have picked up, I talk fast, and I teach a 14-week-long course on the history of Islam in Africa, and I'm going to try to crystallize the best of it into the next 37 minutes. Okay, so human liberty, pacifism, the universality of truth, the centrality of love and compassion in the Islamic tradition, and finally the particular role that scholarship has to play in fostering tolerance and nonviolence. We good? Do we need to catch our breath? All right, that's what's up. So, those principles, just so that they're easy to remember. Humanity's basic condition is freedom, exempt from slavery. This is something that comes up in the Cambridge World History of Slavery pieces that I wrote for volumes 3 and 4. It's something that classically trained scholars return to frequently. Al-asl hurriya, the principle in humanity is freedom, and you have to demonstrate a reason why a person should have that taken from them. This leads to actually very forward-thinking abolitionist thought in parts of Islamic West Africa, and we'll talk about that as one of these principles. Jihad of the soul is above jihad of the sword as the second one. The truth is universal, and the denial of that, in other words, chauvinism on a religious basis, is actually sinfulness. It's pride, which the Prophet described in authentic hadith as denying the truth and holding people in contempt. It's denying the Creator, who is al-Haq, the truth, in the Islamic tradition, and it's having contempt for the creation. And basically, the overarching argument for today's talk is that the Islamic vision for the value of a human being is what's underlying all of these principles, and it's underlying a lot of the way that you see these principles being played out in West African history. Love is the fourth one. The Quran never says Allah yuhib, except that the object of the verb to love is a human being. And what you'll often hear in West Africa is if God loves something other than people, he ain't say so in his book. Which means that the human being holds a particularly honored position, and therefore honoring human beings is honoring what God has honored. and that indeed love is the reason for the creation of the human being in the first place, so that love should constitute a core value in human beings' relationships with one another. I'll come back to that. And then scholarship spreads Islam better than proselytizing. Islamin Sane and others know better than I do. The Jahanke tradition, which was responsible in large part for making the West African components of this map get colored in. The Jahanke are the main instruments for the early spread of Islam, did so without military or political engagement. They systematically abstained from politics and from military activity. And they also systematically abstained from active proselytizing. The goal was never dawah. The goal was teaching and scholarship in their own communities and providing an example for others to emulate. And that model changed West Africa from places that were 0% Muslim in 900 CE to places that are 92, 95, 97% Muslim today. The jihad of the wooden board, those little Quran tablets that you learn Quran on, and you'll see some in a minute, rather than the jihad of the sword. Okay, so scholarship spreads Islam better than proselytizing. So these are principles. These are the people, and I'm going to tell a single story that unites and connects all of them, and it's all embedded in Ahmadou Bamba's vision of peace. 5 stories inside a story. So this is the founder of the Muridiyya. I already explained that he's a classically trained scholar who's the author of at least 200 distinct works that have been identified by the Arabic Literature of Africa series, which is an effort to catalog the Arabic writings of West African scholars. Those 200 works, first of all, that represents the largest single entry for anyone in the Arabic Literature of Africa series, and it probably represents about 1/3 of his actual scholarly production, because many of his works have not been cataloged. Others he himself personally destroyed when he wrote works that he thought were better than those. So this is someone who was deeply embedded in the Islamic scholarly tradition, trained first and foremost as a legal scholar. And he writes legal opinions about peaceful approaches to French occupation, amongst other things, because he lives during the colonial period when Senegal is occupied by France. Literally a life composed of text, which is why you'll often see him represented in calligraphic form. And Murids, people in the Muridiyya will often say that he's the author of 7 tons. I can't get into all the poems and visionary experiences. It would cost us too much time. I just want to focus on one, sort of main one. And this is the center of his community today, the great mosque in Touba in Senegal. And this is what Touba looks like on a Friday. 70 or 80,000 people praying in the mosque. Every year on the 18th of Safar, about 3.5 million people come to the city of Touba on a pilgrimage that is meant to commemorate an important moment in the life of Ahmadou Bamba. And that important moment is the moment that we're going to use to frame the rest of today's talk, okay? And it's going to open onto these pacifistic principles. So that moment is when he is, in 1895, making itikaf. He's making his retreat, his spiritual retreat in the mosque in the last 10 days of Ramadan in the city that he's established 7 years previously in 1888, the city of Touba. Touba at that time does not have a big mosque that looks like this. He prays in a mosque that looks like that one. It's a wooden building that can hold maybe this half of this room and not much more than that. And when Bamba is making his spiritual retreat, he has a waking state vision of the Prophet Muhammad who comes to give him a message. Now, this is not the first time that Bamba has seen the Prophet. When he authored one of his first poems praising previous Sufis, he started seeing the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in dreams and also in waking states. But he would usually see him as a being whose limbs appeared to be made of light. So he would see clothing and light coming out from inside the clothing, or he would see a person veiled behind a screen of light so that he couldn't fully perceive, but the Prophet identified himself. This day in 1895, someday in the last 10 days of Ramadan, he sees the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam again, in a waking state, not a dream, this time no veil. He sees him the way that you see me. So the Prophet in the narration, and this narration comes from two of Ahmadu Bamba's sons and one of his earliest disciples. Bamba never wrote openly about it, but he didn't discourage others from writing about what he had told them. He said the Prophet always speaks first. He said, Assalamu alaikum ya khadim rasul. Peace be upon you, O servant of the messenger. This was the ontological title that Bamba had started taking when the Prophet gave it to him in those first visionary experiences. His aspiration was service, first and foremost, and he's rewarded with the title servant of the messenger. So he responds, Assalamu alaikum ayyuhan nabi wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you, O Prophet, and God's blessing and mercy. Then he asks a question. Because now that the veil of light has been removed, he sees a thing that he did not perceive before. The Prophet is surrounded by throngs of people behind him on all sides. So Bamba asks him, Messenger of God, who are these that are with you? And the response is, these are the people of Badr. They never leave my side, not even for a moment. These are the heroes of the first military conflict in Islam. In conventional accounts, 313 soldiers stand against between 909 and 1,000. The 313 are armed with, at best, 6 suits of armor, 8 horses, and they're going against people in full mail, and they rout the larger enemy. The Quran speaks of this incident and says of the Prophet throwing a handful of pebbles in the direction of the enemy camp, that you did not throw when you threw, God threw. God threw the weapons at the enemy, and God reinforced the Muslims with a party of angels to bring the victory on that day. Badr is a rhetorically powerful and central moment because without that victory in that place, Islam doesn't exist. Islam gets extinguished in a military defeat at that moment, so the people of Badr have an honored station with the Prophet, and that's why they're with him at all times. So, back to the vision. Bamba says, I love you. I too want to be someone who is never absent from you. What do I do in order to join their company? The Prophet's response is, what you ask is going to be difficult. Because the ones that you see with me spilled blood when they didn't want to spill blood. And they had their blood spilled when they didn't want to have their blood spilled. The time for spilling blood has passed. No one can command it any longer. Therefore, you have no sacrifice that you can offer that would make you worthy of their measure. Now, we break into let that sink in, and we break into the middle of the talk. Sufis had fought imperial occupation on any number of occasions. Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi led the resistance to the French occupation of Algeria. He was also the greatest living interpreter of Ibn Arabi in his time, and he was somebody who found fighting personally odious. Elijah Martal, who I mentioned previously, also fought the French in the 1850s and 1860s, this time in the Senegal River Valley. He's the subject of a recent PhD by one of our students here in the Anthro-History program, an advisee of mine, Amir Syed. Elijah Martal's library, and I'm talking about scholarship, was stolen when the French conquered Mali, and they moved the whole library, all 4,100 pieces, to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, where it still is today. So these scholars led this resistance. Usman Dan Fodio in what's now northern Nigeria fought a war not against foreign occupation, but a war against slave trading kings in Hausaland at the end of the 18th century and early part of the 19th century. And these men were all Sufis. One a follower of Ibn Arabi, another a Tijani, the third a Qadri. I talk a little bit about Usman Dan Fodio on Skip Gates's Africa's Great Civilization, so shameless self-promotion. Go check out episode 5, and you'll hear more justice done to Usman Dan Fodio. I can't do him justice in this talk. So I'm not trying to argue in this talk that there's some kind of simplistic equation between Sufism and pacifism. That's decidedly not the case. But I'm also not trying to negate the close link between Sufism and pacifistic discourses in the Islamic tradition. One of the first Sufi sayings that I learned in Wolof was the Sufi is the one who, when he finds a fly drinking from the ink at the tip of his pen, he won't write again until the fly has had its fill. How can one who is so gentle with a fly take the life of a human? And of course, this is a great study of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba by our colleague Sheikh Anta Babu, Fighting the Greater Jihad. Reference to the hadith, we return from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. What is the greater jihad? The jihad against the lower soul and the passions. In the Walking Quran, I talk about the fact that what actually brings scholars, especially those Sufi scholars, into the realm of political activity and military activity, in spite of the fact that models like the Jahanke model, which was for maintaining pious distance from power and not engaging in military activity, was actually the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. That the rise of the Atlantic slave trade caused a sharp critique amongst a certain group of Muslim clerics who ended up reaching the conclusion that there was no nonviolent solution to the problem of Muslims enslaving other Muslims and selling them for bottles of rum. So they took up arms beginning in the 17th century all the way down to the 19th century and developed an indigenous abolitionist tradition, one that is recognized by the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of Slavery in the very first work that he writes on abolition of the slave trade, 20 years before the British abolished the slave trade. He describes Abdul Qadir Khan, the leader of that first revolutionary movement, as a person who's more to be respected than any of the sovereigns of Europe, inasmuch as he has made a nobler sacrifice than they and has done more for the causes of humanity, justice, liberty, and religion. It's an Anglican priest praising an African Muslim for abolishing slavery in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s and 1780s. And if you want to learn more about that, buy the Walking Quran, shameless plug number 2. Can't get into this now. Bring me back to it and I'll read it. But that same emancipatory and abolitionist tradition arrives at these very shores in the bodies of enslaved Africans. And this is an account of a man from Fututoro in 1806 when he's being sold on the dock of Savannah, saying that the law of the Muslims does not allow a believing person to own another believing person and their descendants in perpetuity. So if you Christians are doing that, I'm not interested in your religion. So, principle 1, human liberty. Ahmadou Bamba, when he was starting to become a great sheikh, now we're putting ourselves back into that vision, but we're not in the vision yet, we're back with Bamba. When he was starting to become someone of note, a disciple came to him and made a hadiyah, a gift of a slave, in order to make his bay'ah, his ritual submission to Ahmadou Bamba. And Bamba's response is recorded famously in the oral tradition, Soko mome yamu mom dachmag mom nyo boko borom. And Lamin is laughing because he knows what it means. You'll laugh in a moment. He said, "You own him?" And the man said, "Yes." He said, "If you own him, then you own me, because he and I have the same master." One of the things that I write about in the Cambridge World History of Slavery volumes is that there is a tradition of critique of slavery from within Islam and from within traditions of Islamic scholarship. And if we paid more attention to West Africa, y'all would already know that. Not just liberty, but equality. Tradition of female scholarship is something that is focused heavily on in the Walking Quran. Today, many Quran schools actually have more girls than boys. And that's not a sort of strictly a recent phenomenon. Female scholars play an important role within the Muridiyya and actually within all of the movements that I'm discussing today, all of these West African traditions of tolerance, because of the way that they approach the question of basic human dignity, provide space for women in ritual devotion. So for example, amongst the Jahanke, because men are required by law to lead the prayer, after the prayer, women make the dua. Women make the ritual supplication. often using both the Arabic language and vernacular languages so that people can hear the prayer that's offered for the protection of the community, for the health of the community in their mother tongue, in their African languages. And indeed, Sohna Muslimatu Mbake and Maimuna Kabir Mbake, the two of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba's daughters, wrote extensively both in Arabic and, in their case, in the Wolof language using the Arabic script. So, back to our scholars, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, life made of text, back to the mosque, back to what this day on the 18th of Safar, where these 3.5 million people, what is it that they're celebrating? They're celebrating what happens next in Bamba's vision of the Prophet. So, flashback. What do I do to join the company of the people of Badr? What you ask is going to be difficult, because the ones you see with me spilled blood when they didn't want to spill blood. They had their blood spilled when they didn't want to have their blood spilled. The time for spilling blood is over. In the main narration, it says no one can command it any longer. In another narration, it says it ended with them. It ended with the people of Badr. It ended with the generation that fought alongside the Prophet. This nonviolence in the Muridiyya is not an unthinking commitment to nonviolence that says violence is always bad. It's a commitment to nonviolence that sees the early physical struggles and conflicts in Islam as expiatory, as fulfilling the need for physical conflict for the establishment of Islam, and therefore obviating the conditions that would require it in later times. So, the time for spilling blood is ended. You have no sacrifice that you can offer that will make you worthy of their measure. You can imagine that Bamba would be crestfallen by hearing this news. He just said he loves the Prophet, he wants to be with him all the time, and now he's told he can't come. But the Prophet is always gentle and the best of manners, so he says, but I come with good news. In 3 months you will become the Qutb al-Zaman, the axial saint of your time, the pole of the era. Because no one reaches that status except that they've reached the age of 40. Why the age of 40? It's the age when the revelation comes, it's the age of maturity, and the whole vision, by the way, is a reenactment of the original revelation, because this foundational vision takes place in exactly the same context. Why is he making itikaf? What is itikaf for? It's to commemorate the Prophet's retreat that leads to the first revelations. So he has his own revelation and his own vision. He's going to be made the Qutb al-Zaman, because no one can be that except that they've had their 40th birthday. But then the Prophet says, but this is really only a formality. You'll be 40 in 3 months. If you want, I make you the Qutb beginning today. And Bamba, this whole dialogue, by the way, takes place in Arabic, but Bamba would narrate it in Wolof. So I stick with the Wolof. He says, and it's famous the way that he words it, he says, he says, that would be lovely, that would be beautiful, but my ambitions now surpass this. Being the greatest living Sufi of the time is no longer good enough for me. I want to be amongst those who are never absent from you. I love you, and I can't bear the thought of ever parting with you. Bamba would later write about the great status that those people of Badr had, the expiatory function that they had served, and why they were so important and so central, why he wanted to join their company. And I wanted to give you 2 minutes of his poetry being recited by my favorite reciter, and then I'll give you the translation.
على الخريب ليس الهروب رضا المجيب مع ارتخاء على صحابة سوي الإجابة يوم الكآبة رضا سناء نعم الرجال لهم ما جالوا نيلوا ونالوا وقت الهناء رضا السميع على الجميع يوم الخصوع يوم النداء أربابي خيري أرباب ضير لباخ مير أو اقتداء أرباب ضير لباخ مير أو اقتداء أولو زجاح له اتباه له ارتفاع واخت الرفاء نعم الكومات نعم الهمات عدا أمات بالاختفاء بهم عافوت وما جافوت بهم نفيت سيفتراء تنهى لي خيري أعداء ضيري بأسن خير ما هجراء فولت أمري لمبقي حمري مع أهل بدر بلا امتراء.
It was mentioned that I did verse translation of some of Bamba's poems. One of them is this one. First, he's praising the four caliphs, then Ali specifically. Al-Qaribi Laythul Khurubi. On the near and dear, the lion of war, may he who answers grant ascendancy. Upon the cohort who answered the call in darkest hours, his honor and clemency. In troubled times they were victor and vanquished, theirs is dignity, oh such men. On the day of humility, the day of appeals, may he who hears be pleased with them. Founts of good for seekers of gain, sources of pain for seekers of hostilities. They rose to the occasion in confrontation, full of bravery and loyalty. Such gallant knights, such brave defenders, slaying antagonists without cowardice. By their grace I have pardoned, without malice. By them I've banished the slanderers. Divert my foes, avert all harm, by the kind listener, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who rids of tyranny. I entrust my affairs to him, my renewer, and those at Badr with certainty. The idea is that the sacrifices that were made in that time create the space in which Bamba can articulate his nonviolence. His nonviolence is not a negation of the armed conflict and struggle at the beginning of Islam, but rather it's an understanding of the longer-term function it serves in setting him free. So it leads directly to this philosophy of nonviolence in the Muridiyya, which is not just restricted to the Muridiyya. A person like Sheikh Musa Kamara also writes specifically about the principles of nonviolence. I mentioned before 47 distinct works. He was not just an archival historian who worked with Arabic documents, but he traveled the countryside in Fututoro, the land where he was from, and interviewed the descendants of clerical families in order to write history based on oral history as well. Extraordinary scholar. He also praised the people of Badr in similar terms, devoting a 94-page work, 20 pages of which is a devotional poem to how you can bring blessing upon yourself just by using the names of the individual people in Badr in a formula of sending blessings upon the Prophet. Details if you want. If you ever wanted to know how many people had names that started with which Arabic letter at Badr, Musa Kamara can tell you. 93 had names that started with Ayn. 11 had names that started with Aleph, and he writes about each of them. But his most important work in this vein is, and I'm not giving you the Arabic title just in the interest of time, this is his major work on jihad. Most lovers of jihad after the prophets wanted to make names for themselves and dominion in the land and were not concerned with God's servants who died in jihad. His point was that the jihad and nafs caused one to be very delicate and careful with human life. And that he does not also argue that there are no circumstances that don't justify jihad. He argues that there are certain forms of self-defense that might require it. But he also says that French occupation is no such circumstance because the Muslims are forbidden from committing suicide. The French were capable of killing so many resistors without suffering casualties themselves that it was unethical to try to resist occupation. And this is important because he's coming from the same region that gives the most important 19th century jihadi scholar. Last piece on this, I mentioned this before, this is also described in chapter 2 of the Walking Quran, which the argument of which is framed by the hadith, may or may not be authentic, but we'll go with it because it makes a good point. The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr. This is a basic principle that runs throughout West African Islamic thought, that the jihad of the wooden board is a better instrument for spreading Islam than the jihad of the sword, that the clerices that do that work do it through teaching and for providing benefit to people, and that the Jahanke specifically articulated this as positive principle. Well-known principles acknowledged throughout Jahanke communities across space and time. Unbelief is ignorance, not wickedness. It's God's will for some people to remain in ignorance. Jihad is not acceptable for conversion, legitimate only in self-defense. Muslims can and should support non-Muslim rule if Islamic practice is allowed under it. And Muslims must present an example to be emulated so non-Muslims will be attracted to Islam. You don't preach to them. And the way that you bring that second to last point to life is by making scholarship the center of life. And that is also the reason why Imam Fode Drame has participated willingly with us in Ikhlas events, because he sees bringing Jahanke teachings into a classroom environment as a basic extension of the Jahanke mission in West Africa. You're trying to just teach people about Islam. They'll make up their own minds. And you do that through scholarship, not just schooling, but scholarly production. These are all extremely productive scholars that we've been studying. And you do this in a way that maintains pious distance from power, the same way that the Jahanke did. There's a famous story about Ahmadu Bamba, now we'll get back to him, that when he was asked to come serve as the chief judge for the most powerful non-Muslim, or excuse me, the most powerful pre-colonial kingdom before the establishment of French colonial rule in Senegal, he politely declined 6 or 7 times, but they kept asking him because they wanted his prestige at the court. Finally, he sent a letter to the king. The king's scribe reads the letter to him. And the interaction goes as follows. The scribe opens the letter, he reads it, he says he begins with blessings and invocations, and then the scribe gets visibly angry. And he says, the king says to him, what does the letter say? He said, no, I'm not going to read it. This is very offensive to me. I'm not going to say it out loud. He said, what does it say? He said, no, this harms me personally. I'm not going to read it. I'm your king. I command you. What does it say? Bamba quotes an aphorism of Ibn Maslama, one of the early Muslims, that compares the scholar who curries favor at the court of a sultan to a fly feeding on a pile of feces. So the king says, I don't know what you're so upset about. He's comparing you to a fly. He's calling me a pile of shit. Okay. This was Bamba's stance of maintaining pious distance from power. If you could sum it up in a single phrase, the idea, and this Brother Rashid Umar brought this up in his talk, the idea is separation of church and state, not to separate, to protect the state from the church, but to protect the church from the state. That whenever religious authority becomes too closely tethered to political authority, there are grave moral and ethical risks. And if scholars are the people that are supposed to be capable of providing an autonomous ethical critique of rulers, who is going to provide the autonomous ethical critique of rulers when the scholars have become the rulers? You end up with bad religion and bad politics. So, back to the vision. So Bamba says, that would be lovely, that would be beautiful, but my ambitions now surpass this. Now that I know that there are people who never leave your side even for a moment, my heart can't rest with less than this. And the prophet says to him, do you think you're the only one who ever loved me? All of the saints in my religion love me the way that you love me, and I appear to them the way that I'm appearing to you. But this thing that you asked has neither been asked nor given to any that came before you. And Bamba says to him, listen, I don't know what you want from me. I've told you how much I love you. I've told you that my heart can't settle on less than you. And I'm willing to pay any sacrifice that would be required in order to join the company of the people of Badr. And the prophet says to him, are you sure? He said, oh, I'm sure. He said, then you must go out and face your enemies in your time. You have to go out and face your enemies in your time the way that they face their enemies in their time. But you're forbidden from spilling so much as a single drop of blood. If you spill so much as a single drop of blood, your compact with me is broken. I'm not of you and you're not of me. And if you're going to do that, you must leave this city of Tuba that you love. Because when you came here, you prayed to the Almighty in my name that he protect this place until the day of judgment, and that prayer has already been answered. So you will leave this city that you love and face your enemies in your time. So Bamba finished his fast, he celebrated the Eid, and he packed his bags. What he didn't know is that African chiefs, jealous of his growing authority, had been conspiring with the colonial regime all this time. He was sent away into exile for 7 years and 9 months. And when the white people send you away, you didn't come back, except Bamba did. But that celebration when 3.5 million people come to Tuba isn't for the day that Bamba came back. It's for the day that Bamba was sent away. Because that's the beginning of him paying the price that was needed in order for him to achieve the lofty station that those people that made sacrifices in the early days of Islam did. It's how he was able to draw near to the Prophet through love. And that theme of love is highlighted in another Sufi movement, the Faida Tijaniya, which I don't have enough time to give proper justice to, but I just want to give a few quotes from the founder of the Tijaniya. All of the world is included in God's love, even the disbelievers. Ahmed Tijani, founder of the Tariqa Tijaniya. The bumper sticker that you'll see amongst Tijanis in Chicago is love is God's signature on creation. And the basic reason for this is that God never uses Allah yuhib in the Quran except the object of the verb is human beings. And the basic reason why you create a human being that's capable of turning its back on God is that it's beneath God's dignity to love a thing that's forced to obey. In order for God to have something in creation that's worthy of his love, that thing has to be able to choose freely. And that is the root of Islamic humanism in West Africa, the understanding the investment that God has in every single human being. So that love for humanity is cultivated through cultivating love for the Prophet as the best of creation, alayhi salatu wassalam. And by loving him through those poems that are praising him and his companions, through sending salawat, blessings upon the Prophet, you draw near to him and your heart becomes more expansive and capable of love. But if you're going to realize that, then you also have to follow the Prophet's command. And there's an authentic hadith that says, لَا تَدْخُلُوا الْجَنَّةَ حَتَّى تُؤْمِنُوا وَلَا تُؤْمِنُوا حَتَّى تَحَابُوا. You will not enter the garden until you've believed, and you will not have believed until you've loved one another. Shaykh Ibrahim, expanding on this, quotes the hadith, you will never have faith until you love each other. Shall I tell you what will make you love each other? Spread peace between yourselves. By the one who holds my soul in his hands, you will not enter the paradise until you are merciful. They said, we are merciful. He said, it's not mercy between yourselves. It's mercy in general. It's mercy in general. And Shaykh Ibrahim in his tafsir, 6 volumes of which are there, he's the author of 99 distinct works that are cataloged by the Arabic Literature of Africa series. He talks about that universality of the prophetic message, that all of the faiths have brought the same message. Cherno Bokar Salif Tal, and I'll end here, expands on that idea in his discussion. I'll have to skip this slide in the interest of time. Not just the universality of the prophetic message that is renewed for all of humanity, but the universality of truth. He describes 3 categories of faith. Solid faith. It's the first degree suitable for the masses and teachers who are attached to the letter, channeled by prescriptions imposed by law. It has a precise form and is subject to rigorous determination which admits no foreign element. It's heavy and immobile like a mountain. At times it prescribes armed warfare if this is necessary to gain respect and assure position. But this is the outer layer, the layer that corresponds to Islam and the Hadith of Gabriel. The layer that corresponds to Iman in the Hadith of Gabriel is liquid faith. It's the faith of those who have faced up to the trials of the law. They've triumphed over their faults, and now they value truths from wherever they come, considering neither origin nor date of existence. It gathers them and assembles them to make a body in perpetual movement, flowing across terrains, increasing in size, becoming streams, which as rivers are thrown into the ocean of the truth. This faith, due to its subtle liquid nature, is strong, eroding the rocks of intolerance, pouring forth and taking a shape that is not fixed, but borrowing the form of its receptacle. This faith is vivifying. The final form, which corresponds to ihsan, which corresponds to the Sufi way, is decidedly more subtle. It's the affair of an elite. Those who reach it worship God in truth, in light, without color, On this plane, solid faith and liquid faith emerge from an uncompromising path and vanish to make way for one sole thing, the real himself, which flourishes in the field of love and truth. And anything other than the pursuit of love and truth for Cherno Bokar Salif Tal does not fulfill the conditions of Islam or Ihsan. We'll give Cherno Bokar the last word, since we gave so much time to Ahmadou Bamba and so little time to others. In his focus on the jihad of the soul, he said, "We know only the jihad of the soul. As for the other jihad, it is the mutual killing to which the children of Adam submit one another in the name of a God whom they pretend to love very much, but whom they worship poorly by destroying part of his work." To this, we can only add that this human being is not only part of his work from the standpoint of the Quran, but the most favored element in all creation. All the traditions of tolerance and the principles of pacifism in Islamic West Africa are rooted in that same basic humanistic understanding of what a human being is.
Thank you very much, Professor Ware. We'd like to turn it over to questions and answers now.
Thanks. What are the implications of that idea of pious distance from power in the American Western Muslim scene?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I actually wanted to say something about that to Rashid in response to Rashid Omar's presentation about earlier. So I said this actually recently for a teach-in here at the university, and I said it also for an Investigating Islam community event, and I had said it previously at a khutbah for the Muslim Students Association in response to an incident that happened on this campus, where, well, a block off this campus, where two sisters had headscarves pulled off of their heads. And I explained at that time two basic things. The first is that when God wants to raise the status of an individual or people, he first delivers them into the hands of their enemies, which happens in the stories of all of the prophets, and that's certainly what has happened with recent developments in an American context. We've been delivered into the hands of enemies, but the people that go forth the way that Moses and Aaron did, La tanya fi dhikri, don't slacken in my remembrance, will remember that Moses was the most fragile of things, a baby in a fragile basket on the mightiest river in the world, floating down a river to the mightiest tyrant in the world. The same God that protected him then can protect us now, and that it's an opportunity for us to raise our station. But the more fundamental point was that our activism is profoundly misguided by its lack of spiritual content. And it's because we don't have a precise Quranic diagnosis for the problem of racism. So the first racist from the standpoint of the Quran is Iblis, because Iblis refuses to bow to the form of Adam because he says, I'm better than him, I'm made from fire, he's made from clay. So on the basis of his origins and bodily substance, he disobeys, and he therefore demonstrates pride, which is what racism, which is what white supremacy, which is what Islamophobia, which is what Muslim chauvinism against Jews, which is what Jewish chauvinism against Muslims, it's the same. Now that is a sinfulness that is of satanic origin, it's not of human origin. The fitra of a human being, the fitra given by the Fatir Samawati wal Ard, the innate disposition given by the creator of the world, is of a thing made from dirt. And amulugana sufe suf is what they'll say in Senegal. There's nothing lower than dirt. It works in, the word for low means dirt also in Wolof, so it's even better. The human being knows that it has no claims to pride in its innate disposition. Anytime you see claims of superiority, it's satanic religion. And it spreads through microaggressions like the one that happened to that sister, because it puts a mark on the human heart. And then the heart responds in a particular way towards the kind of person that inflicted that damage upon it, and that's how the devil spreads his religion. Now, to answer your question, if we are formulating social and political interventions that are designed to solve our problems and to shape our activism, but we're not treating the fact that the core root of everything that we face is a sickness of the heart that is of satanic origin, then we are incapable of providing a remedy because we're treating the symptoms, not the cause. And we have copied the techniques and strategies of the American Civil Rights Movement, thinking that sit-ins and protests is what brought about change. But what brought about change was a transcendent human narrative that redeemed both oppressor and oppressed, that was rooted in African-American spirituality, that was about the common destiny of human beings. And the movement that King modeled his movement on was Gandhi's movement, which did the same thing in a different religious context, that we're lacking the spiritual diagnosis and the spiritual activism and the spiritual element. Yeah, that's my answer. Crazy long-winded, sorry.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and I look forward to reading your book. Could you apply your historical perspective to some of the conflicts and troubles in West Africa today? I'm familiar with recent arrests and troubles of an anti-slavery movement in Mauritania, in which the government uses Islam to justify slavery, and I'm wondering if you're familiar with the ways in which the age-old abolitionist movement might be continued, or what's become of it today.
Yeah, the best thing that I can do in answer to the last part of your question, in order to try to be brief this time, is that there's a wonderful political scientist, black Mauritanian called Zakaria Ould Salam, who writes specifically with wonderful subtlety about anti-slavery resistance movements in the Senegal River Valley, both on the Mauritanian side and on the Senegalese side. The kind of broader historical answer is read chapter 3 of the Walking Quran, but one of the things that's saddest in that story is that in the same place where a revolutionary movement that was lauded by the founders of and indeed inspired the founders of the British and French abolitionist movements, in the same region where that took place, after Abdul Qadir Khan is assassinated in 1806, slavery comes back stronger than it had ever been before. And the memory of that abolitionist struggle gets all but erased from the place where it had happened. So there's a long-term struggle in the effort to establish human liberty and dignity in every Muslim society. And part of the argument of chapter 4 of the Walking Quran is that much of that struggle for liberty and equality gets transferred into Sufi movements. They're not explicitly political movements anymore. They're actually trying to stay away from politics. And instead, they're focusing on providing Islamic education to people of formerly enslaved background, to people of casted background, to women, to the poor. And I argue actually that that's the reason why Senegal has such profoundly successful Sufi movements. Pew Research data, polling of different Muslim countries says that 92% of Senegalese self-identify with a Sufi order. The top 11 countries of self-identifying with a Sufi order are all in West Africa. But the next highest one after Senegal at 92% is Chad at about 55. So Senegal is it's the Sufiest place on earth. And part of the reason why I argue in chapter 4 that it becomes the Sufiest place on earth is because people like Ahmadou Bamba and Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse and others invest in extending Sufi structures to disenfranchised people. So it becomes an emancipatory Sufism.
Thank you very much. So it's very comforting for you to say that the peace rallies and the peace walks and the protest are not enough, because I thought I was the only cynical one, and not participating in that actually gets the frown from your fellows, and they think you're not on the same page or you don't care enough. So my understanding is that it really goes down to the curriculum that we are teaching in the schools, starting from the kindergarten, preschool level, all the way to the universities. And because I want to enter the profession of teaching where you are, I see that if we can tweak that, we will be directly contributing to the solution. So when you said that we are supposed to cure the spiritual diagnosis, yes. I have two questions for you. The first is, how would you go about addressing the spiritual diagnosis in the academic atmosphere? when you are dealing with atheists, Christians, Jews, Muslims who are practicing as well as non-practicing, one thing. And the second thing is when the conversation about God is just confined to G's or bless you, and in fact, if you talk more about that, you're regarded as an alien or super pious. How would you deal with that outside of the environment, in the workplace, yet with that mindset that I am going to work on the spiritual diagnosis and not just the activism? Because I'm interning currently at a prison advocate firm,
Okay.
and so that's an issue because there's a lot of anxiety about the social justice, but the balance of humility and rage is absent. And I think a spiritual diagnosis goes hand in hand with the rage and humility, and both are important for activism, but the balance of it, where humility is far more greater than rage.
Rather than rage and humility, I would think about it in terms of taqwa, adl and afu. The Quran says that those are two things that bring you near to taqwa. So they give you two halves of taqwa, and if you put them both together, you have taqwa. So it's maintaining justice and being willing to forego a portion of your right. So that's the first part of the answer to the second question. But the bigger answer to the second question goes back to the Jahanke model. Actually, the answer to both questions go back to the Jahanke model. But the second question is about how do you do this work in a broader world where people look at religious people as though they're aliens, which we're not quite there. I mean, Americans, still attend regular weekly service at a rate that's 7 or 8 times higher than the highest countries in Europe for regular participation. America's a very religious place. It's just, unfortunately, many of those people are not friends to the Muslims. So there's that. But the answer is that, at least as I see it, the Jahanke method is not to tell people what you believe in and to preach about it. It's to provide benefit to the children of Adam. A hadith says that the hearts of the children of Adam naturally incline to those who provide benefit for them. And that what was successful in a lot of the African Americans, so take the Panthers, for example, whether people liked Panther ideology in its outset or not, they liked hot breakfast and daycare. And if you show up every day and serve people, that's why Ahmadou Bamba, I can't talk about khidma in this talk because I have to talk about nonviolence, but khidma is every bit as important to the Muridiyya as nonviolence is. Service to humanity is how you draw people to Islam, not just the teaching. Providing benefit to them. And I said in another khutbah, I said, look, I accepted Islam when I was 15 years old. I might have accepted it when I was 7 or 8 because I lived in crushing poverty till the age of 8. That we literally never finished a lease at a single address. We were evicted from every place that I had ever lived. And I told the Muslim Students Associations, largely, kind of middle class and immigrant in origin, that if any of you had ever come to my house with a hot meal, I'd have read anything you wanted me to read. But you weren't there then, and you're not there now, because your intervention is classist. And it's at campuses like this, and it's attempting to fit in, with the kind of broader part of the society. And it doesn't follow the prophetic methodology, because the prophetic methodology of all the prophets is to start with the poor and the meek. And if you did that, and provided benefit to the poor and the meek, you wouldn't have to do so much preaching. Because pride stinks. And most of American Muslim dawah is done from a position of superiority. I've got something that makes me better than you. The way that Ahmadou Bamba describes the cure for pride, he said the cure for pride is to contemplate your body and the way it was created. You're not above anyone. You start your life as a nasty drop of sperm, you live your life as a walking sack of feces, and you end your life as a corpse, odious and rotting. You are all the children of Adam, and it is from dirt that you were created. If you go with that attitude to the people, that I'm not better than anybody else, then they might want what you have. But if you go with the attitude that what I've got is better than you, then they know you're not an ethical person, because they can see that. And that goes to the answer to the first question. How do you teach these values in an academic context? So Imam Fore Drame and I designed, and last year co-taught, and this year he didn't have the time, so I taught it alone, a class called The Quran, the Prophet, and Islamic Ethics, where we teach Quran in order of revelation and map it onto Sirah in order to explain the contents of the 7 akhlaq, the 7 character traits that the Quran describes as beloved. So I mentioned before that Allah yuhib is always followed by by reference to a human being. It's actually more specific than that. It's always followed by a reference to a human being that's displaying one of 7 character traits. Tawbah, write this down. Tahara, taqwa, ihsan, sabr, qist, tawakkul. So repentance, candor, reverence, excellence or piety, patient perseverance, uprightness or justice, and reliance upon God. If God loves something else, he ain't say so in his book. So the way that I teach that is by showing people what an Islamic ethical framework looks like in the Quran and in the life of the Prophet. And that's something that Muslim, non-Muslim, Christian, atheist, they're all interested because they want to understand how the sacred text and the archetype of Islam, the Prophet ﷺ, how those things construct ethical values. Because that's quite a different thing than how ISIS does.
I don't think but the question was, I think, the way I understood that, how do you diagnose spirituality?
Mm.
And it seems to me that if somebody doesn't believe in this Sufism or any other Sufi idea, that might question this situation as being narrow in its approach, and you might would like to call it Islamic approach to spirituality.
Sure.
And if you emphasize Islam rather than some other spiritual approach, it might be limiting to be inclusive in the family of spirituality.
Yeah.
So, how would you consider other spiritual approaches in your view?
Excuse me, if I may intervene, thank you so much for your question. It's a wonderful question, but we've gone over our time and lunch is waiting. So if we can continue the conversation over lunch.
I'd be happy to answer it over lunch, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ware.